As I mentioned, the PJM State Regulators Group has been looking at these market issues as well as the environmental issues. And it's really great to have some state officials and another special guest to discuss what we've heard. And if they want to make their way up to the stage, I will also introduce to you the moderator of this panel, Jennifer Chen. Jenny is Senior Counsel for Federal Energy Policy at the Nicholas Institute, but many of you also know Jenny from her work on the grid at the Natural Resources Defense Council and her prior work at FERC. So Jenny, take us through this panel.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Doug, for that kind introduction. And the panelists that I have here are I'm not going to, unfortunately, give them as long of an introduction, but they do deserve a lot more than what I had. So just very briefly, from the very far extreme left is Norman Bay. And he's a partner at Willkie Farr, and he's a former chair of FERC, as you all know. Next to him is Mariana Holden, Commissioner of New Jersey, BPU. And next to her is Brien Sheahan, Chair of Illinois Commerce Commission. And right to my left is Beth Trombold, Commissioner of Ohio PUC. So we do have a lot to reflect on. First, let's talk about fuel security, resilience, and some of the comments that we've heard this morning. So we've heard an excellent presentation from Allison. She provided the resilience framework from the customer perspective. Stu told us a little bit about fuel security and potentially needing a new term for that, but PJM's study on fuel security and how it found that that really there isn't much to be worried about unless if you look at extreme conditions. Commissioner Glick, who talked about the need for flexibility in transmission and that fuel security in most regions isn't such an issue. And Joe Bowering, who just talked about how markets have worked and are resilient and don't need radical change. I mean, we know that in terms of resilience, there are regional differences, and that maybe there isn't a one-size-fits-all. We've seen wildfires in California, extreme weather in the Midwest, and hurricanes along the East Coast. So the first question that I wanted to pose to the panelists is, what do you think is a pressing resilience issue in your states or region? And do you want to maybe provide that in the context of what we've heard this morning? Brien?
You want any of us just to jump in?
Yeah, just jump, yeah.
Well, I think that this morning's panels have really been, and this afternoon's panels have really been terrific and illuminating. I think, I think Commissioner Glick talked about these issues in the context of just finding a way to support certain generation. I think Joe also touched on that. I think the way Joe framed it is right, and you alluded to it in your question. I think, what problem are we trying to solve? And I guess the way I see it, I think the way we see it in Illinois is the light at the end of the tunnel is not the states taking over responsibility for national compliance with the Paris Accord or climate change. It's not some dramatically new technology around battery storage or economics. It actually, the light at the end of the tunnel actually is a train. It's called climate change. And some states, like Illinois, have chosen to do something about it. And Joe kind of just glosses over the price of carbon. But when states choose to support the clean air attributes, or certainly the zero carbon attributes of certain generation like nuclear, that's an important thing for the RTOs to pay attention to. I really have always admired and respected Joe's candor. And I think he put it well. I think, basically if you don't like PJM's approach to it, you need to get out. And so I don't think that these issues really bear on fuel security or resiliency, although there are I think tweaks that can be made. I hope we can talk about resiliency in the context of cyber. I think that's really important. But for states like Illinois that have policy that is attempting to respond to climate change, our choice is going to be to not participate, I think, ultimately, in the capacity markets as they are currently designed. And so that's just the political reality, I think.
Am I on? Oh. Coming from Ohio perspective, we're a retail choice state. We embrace competition. Our entire state is in the PJM footprint, unlike some of the others in PJM and the 14 entities. So we have a little different perspective as far as what goes on and our views on things. Not dissimilar to what Commissioner Sheahan said, but in many ways we are a little different. And I think resiliency for us is always part of the equation, but it all comes down to the cost. And I think at the end of the day, that is probably one of the big features of any kind of proposal that PJM puts forward, is what kind of cost and impact is that to the ratepayers in Ohio? And that isn't always in the forefront of what they're working on, but it is in the forefront as a regulator and being beholden to the ratepayers in the state. And so I think resiliency is definitely a part of the equation, but it's always been. And we feel like, there has to be a discussion about what is that tipping point between what degree of resiliency you have to have in order to maintain the system that you want. And so I think, again, Ohio looks at that very critically and has been very engaged in a lot of the FERC policies and filings and whatnot.
Well, in New Jersey, I think we need to, and this is across the board, it's just one way we look at it in New Jersey, is reliability and resilience. I don't think we really know the difference between the two. We keep using them interchangeably. So I like to look at reliability as sort of the way you conduct your personal life. If you're leading a healthy lifestyle to ward off disease, and resilience, on the other hand, is how quickly you recover from a trauma. So you could be super healthy and reliable, yet get hit by a truck and die, or experience long-term disability. So being reliable doesn't necessarily make you resilient. And part of that resilience, of course, we keep learning these lessons from these traumatic storms. I mean, I can date myself back to 1965 with the Northeast blackout. 1998, the super ice storms in Canada. 2003, what cascading effect of the transmission system up from Ohio, up through the Midwest to the Canada, back down through New York, and stopping again in New Jersey. But all of these events are traumatic, and we've learned things from them, and we've learned to become resilient because of them. But that's not the day-to-day operation, which is the reliability. Now, on top of that, New Jersey has been a leader in the charge for cybersecurity and cybersecurity measures. So I charge that not only is it looking at this from a PJM point of view or a bulk system point of view, but you take that catastrophic failure. And let's say, and I'm going to bring up water and wastewater, because water is one of the things I concentrate on. You lose your electrical system. You lose the power to process, pump water, or run a wastewater facility. Isn't that the perfect time for a cyber attack? You can really cripple this country. I don't think we're looking at enough scenarios in our resilience planning to take into consideration these things that actually could happen, not these extremes of weather coupled with, a possible shortage of fuel here. I think we need to look at more day-to-day actual things that can compound some of the traumatic events that we've been through.
And I agree that one of the first and really important issues is how you define resilience. And that came out in some of the concurrences in the FERC order that created the resilience docket. Is resilience the same thing as reliability or a subset of reliability? Does it overlap with reliability, or is it something different? And so until you know what the definition of resilience is, it's hard to figure out what the solution set ought to be. Interestingly, if you look at the RTO ISO filings in response to the FERC order, they all have slightly different definitions of resilience. And some actually say that they view resilience as a subset of reliability. And when you look at the solutions that they propose to strengthen resilience, many of them cite things like transmission, strengthening the grid, enhancing interregional market-to-market operations, valuing essential reliability services, promoting flexible resources, including microgrids and gas-electric coordination. So at least from their filings, and one thing I appreciate about the filings is that they've really focused on what I would regard as the basics to market design and operation.
Great, thank you for that. So we've heard a lot of different things. So, it's not necessarily that that climate is an issue that we need to focus on, and that itself could be a resilience issue. That it's the consumer costs that really matter, and that there are a whole suite of other things that we can look at on the wholesale system, like transmission, DERs, microgrids, and other types of market reforms. One thing that I didn't hear too much of is fuel security, and PJM is thinking about pricing fuel security into the capacity market. Do you have thoughts about that? And do you think that that is going to serve a resilience purpose in your state?
I kind of think about, there are two ways to think about it, right? Fuel security, resiliency, and in the context of price formation, are these just, I think as Joe sort of alludes to, kind of creative administrative ways to, generate enough cost to keep something going, or are they somehow, legitimate? I think because I do think that light at the end of the tunnel is climate change coming at us quickly, I think we do need to focus on resiliency of the physical system. And from the standpoint of cyber. These are public numbers, but articles over the last few years have said that knocking out anywhere from 6 to 9 or so substations around the country could knock down the Eastern Interconnect. I mean, that's astounding. That's something we need to do about it. If you overlay cyber on, and a lot has been in the news lately about cyber. Frankly, the utilities like to kind of tap down the talk about the threat, but it's real, it's there. Homeland Security published a report just this week, I think, that talks about what that would really look like. And it's scary. And so those are things we really have to do something about. In terms of fuel security and resiliency in the context of price, I think Joe put it well. If you don't like the way the capacity market works, then get out. And there are alternatives for that, and so I think that's actually a pretty short aspect of the conversation for me.
I have a trouble with, and I guess the same trouble that Stu had with calling it fuel security. I think where the insecurity comes for me is in a lack of fuel diversity. You lose your gas pipelines, and there's only 2 that are coming into New Jersey, 2 large ones. You lose that, not only is the Northeast, but New York and New Jersey are cut off. That's why we are doing the zero emission credits for our nuclear power plants. That's our base load. That's like 45% of where our electrons come from, are those nuclear power plants. And by the admission of PJM, their study showed on fuel security that we are fuel secure. I mean, the greatest cause of major disruption has been either severe weather or Hurricane Sandy, and this is from the DOE. It's only 95% of the major problems, and it's less than 0.08% between generation inadequacy and fuel supply emergencies. So why are we pricing something? It's just adding cost to something that we as regulators struggle with, trying to price energy as well as all of these little adders that keep being propped up on top of the cost. We're better off looking at how we can bring transmission prices down, because that is what's growing, has been growing astronomically. But do we need the trend to strengthen transmission and distribution? Perhaps in some cases, but when we don't have proper modeling to show that, or up-to-date modeling, you don't just throw money at a problem and think it's going to solve it.
I think just in piggyback to what Commissioner Holden said, the PJM report, as I read it, showed no short-term issues. So that's good news, right? And they even did some extreme testing and found that just low probability events might be enough to hurt the system. But I think the good news is that, you know, the system is strong, and the system was able to withstand a lot of testing. So, and we have a lot of reserves already on the system. So to what Commissioner Holden said, you know, if we're just going to look at it in terms of costs, we have to prove why those costs are necessary given what the findings were from that study.
It seems that we've been having this conversation for a long time, right, about fuel security. And I was reminded of that as I was preparing for this panel yesterday. And I read through some of my notes and filings that have been made at the commission. But let me read one thing to you. And this really builds off of the points from Commissioner Holden and Commissioner Trombold. In a 14-day period of cold weather with typical winter load and generation retirements announced as of October 1st, 2018, PJM's system can withstand an extended period of stress while remaining reliable, even in an extreme scenario such as an extended period of severe weather combined with high customer demand and a fuel supply disruption. The PJM system would still remain reliable. So who wrote this? PJM in the report as of November 1st, 2018, so 6 weeks ago or so. And when you read through the report, it basically says that the contingency that they're concerned about is one that would arise 5 years from now, so that's one condition, that there be an acceleration in retirements beyond those already announced, where there's a major disruption to the gas supply, where there's extreme winter load, and where the situation persists for 14 days. And so it's interesting to me that no other RTO ISO, including RTOs with a similar generation mix, have asked for a similar proposal. And if you were to put in place this kind of proposal, at what point would you be able to say, now we no longer have to worry about this situation? Or are you basically saying that the resource mix has to be pretty much set in stone? And what would that do to the market? And just from the standpoint of the FPA, if FERC were to act on this proposal in its open proceeding, it would have to use its authority under Section 206. That would require a finding that PJM's current market rules are not just and reasonable, and that the proposal is just and reasonable. And so I think many would question whether there is an adequate record to make that kind of finding. I also think that there would be an opportunity cost for PJM and the Commission to head down that path instead of focusing on what I just described as the basics, transmission, market-to-market operations, incenting essential reliability services and flexible resources, improving price formation, allowing new technologies to compete in the markets, including storage and DER. So I think that there is a much better use of both the Commission's resources as well as PJM's.
It would also be nice if renewables would be eligible for this fuel secure resources. The New Jersey, since 2008, we've invested a tremendous amount of money in clean energy sources, and this, that this doesn't get considered.
Okay, thanks for those thoughts. The capacity market came up a number of times, especially in the context of costs. We know that there have been a number of filings at FERC related to the capacity market that have been contentious recently. So we have the filings from PJM and a group of generators related to accommodating or attempting to accommodate state public policies with the capacity market. A revision to the demand curve, the capacity market demand curve that's administratively set by PJM, and that determines the amount of capacity that customers must buy. There are also pending complaints at FERC from load and demand response providers asking to move away from a purely annual capacity market and move toward a more seasonal capacity market. So along with that and the potential to price fuel security in the capacity market, I'd like to ask the panelists, what do you think about, do you think the capacity market is functioning well in your view, and has it served the needs of your constituents? And if not, what would you like to change about it?
My head always seems to be on the guillotine here first. You know what, I really appreciate Commissioner Glick's remarks, and I agree with them in a lot of ways. I think that, he talked about the pace of innovation and the changing economics. Those are things we're certainly focused on in Illinois. We're focused on, importantly, on encouraging carbon-free generation. And so those are things, frankly, I think that, Joe had a great presentation, but, just totally glossed over the cost of carbon. And for states like Illinois that care about that, the capacity markets, frankly, just don't work. They don't. If you want to frame it in terms of the problem to be solved, they don't address the problem that we have. And unfortunately, at least in our case in Illinois, PJM hasn't been accommodative towards our concerns. They've chosen to mitigate our state support for those clean air attributes of nuclear power. And if the response is, we're gonna mitigate, then the state is gonna look at alternatives, and they won't include the capacity market. I think the FRR or some flavor of that, depending on what FERC does, is what we'll do. Illinois is only, I think, 10 or 12% of PJM's load. I think New Jersey, which also has support for nuclears, is about the same. But if you start to piece some of these states together, you get close to a quarter of their total load. And if you take that out, you really begin to think about the future of capacity markets, I think, altogether. And if you want to consider what they might do, if they bring their version of accommodation to renewables, and actually mitigate and not accommodate, then states politically are just not going to sit by and let PJM mitigate their clean air policy. And so maybe there's another way to do it. I think Stu mentioned, thinking about the energy and reserve markets in the face of high penetration of renewables. And I'm sure there are solutions there, but the capacity markets as they are formulated today don't work for Illinois.
Well, we vehemently challenged capacity performance, and then Chairman Bay actually cited our board in two of his dissents, some of our comments, but I think we all agreed that load would be paying a premium for capacity, but the board and others questioned the benefits that ratepayers would actually get from the changes that PJM introduced after the polar vortex. And it was almost like a Chicken Little, loosey-goosey, whatever else, the sky is falling. And I look back on a small municipal system that I ran, and we used to buy in a group with the other municipal systems in the state, and we always bought certainty. So it's the hottest day of the year. Instead of buying at 2 o'clock in the morning in February, whatever, and we were always paying this extra premium. So I pulled our municipal system out of that pool, and we started buying in tranches. And it saved a tremendous amount for our, and we never did without, we never had to buy extra, because we actually put a little thought into it rather than overreacting in purchasing power.
From Ohio's perspective, we're situated, like I said before, a little differently, so I'm going to respectfully disagree a little bit from my colleagues here, but we're one of the few states that actually supported capacity performance when it was proposed after the polar vortex. I remember being a new commissioner and sitting on the line back then during the storm, and it was a lot of nail biting going on as far as whether or not we were going to be able to sustain power throughout our region. And I remember thinking, you know, there's got to be a better way. And you know, during the discussions on capacity performance, Ohio did a lot of analysis on what that would mean for ratepayers. And it turned out that we were onto something, because we did not see prices go up dramatically, if at all. Did they go up at all, Stu? Just a little bit, as a result of capacity performance. And I think it also put those generators on notice that, you know, they've got to get their systems together and make sure they're there when we need them. So from that standpoint, Ohio's been a little different and kind of has marched to the beat of our own drum. I think in addition to that, we believe in competition. We're a retail choice state, and until our legislature tells us differently, we're going to continue down that path. We're out of the generation business, as our chairman likes to say. And so therefore, we are concerned about the fuel mix, but that's not part of our daily, I guess, part of the things that we look at daily. But I will say the capacity market, you know, it's not perfect. I'm not going to sit here and say that. I don't know that anybody would say it was perfect, right? But at the same time, it's what we got, and I think it's the most economic way of pricing that we have for now. And, you know, there's going to be some changes that need to be made as changes occur in the market, occur in the systems. And we'd continue to work with the Organization of PJM States, or OPSI, which is our fellow commissioners in the region, and with PJM on it. And, you know, we don't always agree, but, you know, I think at the end of the day, we do put forward some really good proposals and advice to PJM and to FERC for them to think about as far as how these different policies will affect our states. And I think, you know, all of Ohio is part of PJM. And so I think we're in a different situation maybe than some other states, because we are looking at it from a large impact. 22% of PJM's load is in Ohio. And therefore, we just a lot of times have a different perspective, so.
It just would be nice to have some consistency. Do you realize that the capacity performance has changed 30 times in 10 years? So obviously, it's needing tweaking. It needs some consistency behind it.
So my comments build off of what Commissioner Holden just said. Though first, I think we should acknowledge that the energy market in PJM works well, and it's producing competitive outcomes from which consumers have benefited. And PJM deserves a lot of credit with respect to the energy market. It's the capacity market that seems to have engendered the greatest amount of controversy. And as Commissioner Holden noted, there have been different designs over the years. From 2007 through 2015, PJM used RPM. Then in April 2015, PJM proposed and the Commission accepted a capacity performance, in part to ensure that capacity resources would respond when called upon and that they would procure fuel supplies. Then, of course, earlier this year, PJM made its jump ball filing. FERC rejected the filing, but suggested that there should be an expanded MOPR plus FRR, and PJM has just responded with its filing, fleshing out those proposals and adding a resource carve-out option. And I don't know where the Commission will end up on this, but I do think that whatever design the Commission considers, that it should be sustainable and durable. I think it is very hard for stakeholders to deal with significant changes to design, market design every few years. And so I think I would really emphasize the importance of coming up with a sustainable and durable design. It doesn't have to be the best design. That may not be possible, as Joe Bowering noted, but it should be a reasonably efficient design that produces just and reasonable outcomes. I would also say that the design would have to reflect proper respect for state authority, particularly state authority over generation and resource decisions. And then the design should also, in my view, plan for the grid of the future. We know that a dramatic amount of change is happening. How do we create market rules and products that can respond to that change?
Great, thank you for that. So there's a range of dissatisfaction with the capacity market, and we've expressed that, the panel has expressed that some changes need to be made, and yet at the same time, we want to provide stakeholders with some amount of certainty in the markets. The next question goes to process and governance. So if we're looking at if some states are expressing an interest in leaving PJM or leaving the capacity market, or if some states are thinking that we really need to change the capacity market to make it work for our stakeholders and constituents, how can we best accomplish that? But maybe just to set the stage a little bit, I wanted to first ask, okay, so we know that traditionally states have had authority over regulating resource adequacy, how much the reserve margin is, what kinds of resources are on their systems. And with the capacity market and the evolution of it over the past 10 years or more, do you think that the capacity market or the evolution of the market has changed in a way that has taken away some of the state authority over resource adequacy? And is that something that your state envisioned when you agreed to the current construct of the capacity market, or the basic construct of it?
Well, I guess since we were the first to sort of say we've had it with PJM, because we just weren't getting any, we didn't feel we had representation. We had an issue, a Seams issue with another ISO, and instead of PJM supporting its membership, it was like, well, they have a point and whatever. It's like, we're missing that one word, support. And I can say the relationship has improved greatly. So what may have been out there as a perceived threat, we're still in a dance among the stakeholders, but we want respect. And part of the capacity market order, the board felt that FERC, in the first place, had overstepped the line into state jurisdiction. And the legislature had preserved the Board of Public Utilities authority over generation mix in the legislation. And so we challenged the FERC that was taking that away. But rehearing is pending, so we don't know the outcome of that. But we're not alone in making these challenges. We've historically protested the RPM capacity market. Our main concerns included the lack of opportunity for alternative generation and lack of analysis leading to the selection of least cost solution. For instance, BPU was concerned that additional merchant generation would become the predominant source of increased capacity. And today this concern has come to fruition. There's no method of evaluating distributed generation, transmission upgrades, load management programs to address the system need. And PJM's RPMs is a one-size-fits-all solution. If there's enough generation, higher prices must be the solution. And as regulators, we know there are other means to solve some of these problems. And we need meaningful analysis of alternatives, as we've protested going back to 2005, 2006. We'd like to have representation in the stakeholder process. Yes, a stakeholder process takes place, but we'd like to have respect in the stakeholder process. And that when we're moving towards an answer, not to come out with a letter of decree from PJM saying, well, you didn't work fast enough, and so we're just moving ahead. So let's take a look at what happens in some of these things, so we're talking about governance. What will happen is a problem statement will be put forward, but the problem statement already has a white paper that's been produced. And so there's the problem, here's the issue, but here's the answer, and everybody has to scramble. There's no stakeholder input ahead of time into that process. And so therefore there's hearing, rehearing, filings, unnecessary expense that has to be done instead of working together. And that's what needs to be done instead of publishing decrees. Well, I'm sorry, you didn't work fast enough. So the board has decided that PJM is going to do X, Y, and Z. That's not good governance, and that's not communicating or collaborating. So you wonder why people want to pull out of PJM? That could be a good reason.
Yeah, I would second all of that. I think the letter certainly has rubbed people the wrong way. I've been pretty hard on PJM. I don't want people to think though that I don't appreciate the efforts. They've got a very, very difficult job, and I think Stu characterized it as tension, and I think that's right. I mean, there is enormous tension between the job they have and the policies that states express. But having said that, the markets don't exist for their own sake, and competition doesn't exist for its own sake. They exist to serve a public purpose, and states have traditionally, and the courts continue to affirm the state's authority to regulate generation. We are restructured, but like Ohio, but we have the largest nuclear fleet in the country. So that's an important consideration, and a little bit different maybe than some other states. I really don't know how the tension gets resolved. I think Joe may be right. I think PJM may have to just decide, look, this is the best we can do, and if it doesn't fit for your state, then we have some other alternatives. And I think ultimately that's I'm not speaking for the state. This is my own personal view, but I think nuclear power in Illinois is going to be around for a long time, and I think in a legislative environment where we couldn't get a state budget for 3 years, we got a big energy package, and support for the nuclear power plants, energy efficiency and renewables was at the heart of that. And so that's Illinois' policy, and I don't see it the state bowing to PJM's version of what the capacity market should look like.
So The Organization of PJM States, OPSI, has been reviewing governance issues regarding PJM for the last year or so. There was a report that was put out, and we've been having a lot of conversations. So I think there's still more to come in talking about ways to improve governance at PJM. So I think that's still on the table. As far as the MOPR and FRR filings pending at FERC, Ohio weighed in on that on our own, and our comments basically said that, you know, we're for a level playing field. We understand that states need to do what states need to do. As in Illinois, they need to do things that they feel their state in their state best interest. But at the end of the day, you're part of a region, and we want a level playing field for the region in terms of pricing capacity and in terms of the electric market. And so I guess that's where we kind of part ways a little bit. And regardless of the fact that there is some state subsidies on a few minor, in a small way on some plants in Ohio, we feel as though that ratepayers are still on the hook for that because we want that level playing field. We want that competition to flourish. And so I think that's where we differ a little bit from other states. We totally respect the state public policies of those states, and we also embrace competition.
So markets obviously promote competition, which in turn leads to efficiency. Markets also offer transparency in a way that the bilateral markets don't. They can enhance reliability and innovation while shifting risk from ratepayers to shareholders. Markets can also help facilitate a higher penetration of renewables because they provide load and resource diversity. And so for many reasons, I think markets provide tremendous value to consumers. And so I very much hope that whatever tension currently exists between states and PJM can be resolved. I think that the stakes are significant, and they're significant not only in PJM, but even in other parts of the country where you have bilateral markets where stakeholders are considering regionalization. I spoke at an Advanced Energy Economy conference in Sacramento a few months ago, and was supporting the idea of regionalization, but there were a lot of critics of markets, and what the critics focused on included the capacity markets and the concern that FERC would be telling states what kinds of resource decisions they could make. And so the issues here, I think, are not just regional in nature, but they have national implications as well.
I think it would be really nice if, for OPSI, to be able to have a list of priorities that they work on together with PJM, that this is what we're going to work on this year, this coming year, and set that list of priorities. What's the most important thing that we have to consider and work on? And does that fit with your state's public policy? We're not going to set the public policy for you. That is the purview of each state, or collaboratively within OPSI and the FERC. It is not for the transmission regional operator to set the goals, public policy. We have to carry out what the legislature tells us and what the governor's office and the governor's energy policy office. That's what we're bound by. And to just dismiss it and say, well, you know, that's just not going to be part of this construct, or we're going to pile on extra costs. You know, where was the discussion? The stakeholder process just doesn't stop like that unless both sides say, you know, we've both done the best we could do, and we can't come to a conclusion, but here's where we can come to consensus. And that doesn't seem to be happening, and that should be happening.
Thank you. So we're hearing that there are some some extreme to mild dissatisfaction with the governance process in PJM, especially as it pertains to resource adequacy and the state's public policy and how states would like to influence their resources that are in their footprints. But at the same time, we're hearing that markets provide efficiency and a least cost way of obtaining whatever it is that that we're defining to be the market products. I'm curious to know more about what OPSI is thinking in terms of governance. And Commissioner Glick had also mentioned that he would be very interested in revisiting governance. So maybe one question to throw out here is, we know that other multi-state RTOs have different types of state governance over resource adequacy. So in SPP, for example, the Regional State Committee, composed of members from each member state in SPP, can make Section 205 filings on resource adequacy, and they have to approve filings to FERC regarding resource adequacy proposals. And in MISO, we know that MISO comes up with its own planning reserve margin, but MISO would defer to the state's planning reserve margins if they were to differ. So are there elements of other types of governance from other RTOs that we can borrow here? Or what other types of governance changes you would like to see in PJM that we could offer up?
I think the question, it sort of answered itself. I mean, other state commissions work very closely. And I don't understand why that can't happen within our region. I know it's a large one, much larger than some of the others, but that doesn't, doesn't mean we should be sitting on the sidelines and finding out all of a sudden that we're fighting PJM at the FERC. Is there a problem? Can we work together and work it through? I mean, we've been on the sidelines on several state positions. One that's really, really annoying is that the stakeholder process that was overlooked on the capacity value of wind. And we have the largest solicitation of offshore wind out there right now. We're looking at revisions and reducing the capacity value of wind during it. The stakeholder process for BPU is setting its offshore renewable energy credit price, and how we're going to do that process. And it's like getting your knees cut out from underneath you, your legs cut out from under you. There needs to be that, just what you're asking in the question of like the Southwest Power Pool and MISO does.
I think governance is a lot about process, but it's also about communication. And I think that's something that I think we all could do better at. And I know that the panels that we've had at our OPSI meetings regarding governance have talked about the stakeholder process and how that could be improved and how the voting works. And I think there just needs to be a general education as far as the process in place, and maybe coming up with some ways to make that more applicable to what the states are thinking too, and taking into consideration what some of the states' comments are in that process. So I think there's a way to do this that makes sense for everyone, and I sense there might be a willingness to do it. I hope that's true. And I think it's going to continue to be like a drumbeat that you're going to hear from OPSI for a while, is this governance issue. We'll continue to talk about it.
I've advocated moving the state to a different RTO, so I guess I'm kind of past talking about what I think the changes could be. I mean, my experience has been that there's a willingness to talk, but it never seems to sink in. So I've not personally been satisfied that the communication or the results of the communication have been worthwhile. Having said that, I think any form of governance that results in greater responsiveness to state environmental and climate choices, I think, is important.
I think there may be an opportunity to ask FERC if it would hold a technical conference on the stakeholder processes in the RTOs, ISOs. And one reason I say that is because the DC Circuit in 2017 issued an opinion by now Justice Kavanaugh in which it said that FERC could accept or reject a Section 205 filing, but could not impose conditions in its order. It could only make kind of minor technical administrative changes. And thus, the RTO ISO stakeholder process is more important than ever, which means that given the importance of the process, I think critical stakeholders should have a seat and voice at the table, or at least that would be the question, and that FERC could explore. It's been a long time since FERC examined the stakeholder processes in the RTOs, ISOs, but the concern that you hear today on the panel is one you actually hear from people in industry as well. And so I don't think that this is simply state commissioners having some concerns about the process. I think many stakeholders around the country have concerns about the processes that their RTO ISO is using. So I also don't think it's an issue restricted to PJM.
Okay, well, this has been a really great discussion so far, but I wanted to, I've got more questions I'd love to ask, but I just wanted to check in with the audience and see if any of you have any questions.
Yeah, I'm John Chelk with the Electric Power Supply Association, and want to thank all the panelists for their candor. So I'm going to reciprocate and make 2 points, and would welcome the rebuttal to them. The first one is, I think we've heard all throughout the discussion today, and you all, several of you have mentioned this, that somehow the state jurisdiction over the resource mix automatically, without any intervening analysis or thought, justifies the out-of-market payments and subsidies. But isn't it a fact, I'm looking to my home state of Illinois, Brien, and to New Jersey, your states also chose in your resource mix to cite carbon-emitting fossil fuel plants. And those plants are as entitled to just and reasonable compensation under the Federal Power Act as the nuclear plants. And then related to that, the assertion seems to be, and I'm not one normally to carry PJM's water, but nobody else has offered this rebuttal point, the assertion seems to be, with respect to carbon, that PJM is standing in the way of your state's pricing carbon, when in fact 2 of your fellow states, I believe Delaware and Maryland, are in RGGI, and that prices carbon in PJM, and FERC don't stand in the way. And in fact, your state, Illinois, did not choose to join RGGI, and New Jersey pulled out. So I'm trying to reconcile those 2 assertions with the points I just made in interest of full and fair discussion, and would welcome your thoughts on either or both of them.
Well, the first is that New Jersey is trying to get back into RGGI, and that's not an easy process. You don't just sign up and say we're back in. The also is I think we have to look at what just carbon.
I do think that
sources are not just renewables. We're looking at huge resource of carbon or zero emissions out of the nuclear plants, which run all the time and can't lose that resource, and are perhaps what kept us going in Superstorm Sandy, and you're able to restart some of these other plants off of that. So that's the importance of it, besides all the other policy considerations of the loss of these well-paying jobs, the loss of the tax revenue in those areas. I mean, those are little ancillary things, but this is something you can close a gas plant, you can reopen it. You can close a coal plant, you can reopen it, you can restock it. You can't do that with a nuclear plant. Once it's gone, it's gone. And as you can see from the trends that were shown, you're losing 50% of the pricing over the years that Mr. Bowring showed in the trends. It's got to do something to rescue these plants to keep them competitive. Doesn't say they're automatically going to get a credit, but to keep them competitive.
Yeah, John, as you know, since the late 90s, Illinois hasn't approved generation, hasn't regulated generation. And I don't want to diminish the challenges that private businesses are confronted when policy changes. I think that it's important to note that appellate courts in Illinois and New York affirmed the state's right to make the choices that it made in terms of providing compensation for the clean air attributes of nuclear power, and presumably the effects of that on other plants were considered by the legislature. You have entry and exit in any market, and as we've discussed, even the capacity market has changed, dozens of times, and unfortunately, it's just a risk. I think the reality today, though, is, and I think Joe's challenge to think about what we would do if we were designing a system today is, today, if you were designing a system, you would never build a thermal plant. You would never build a gas plant because of the climate implications. If you really price in the negative externalities, we'd probably only be building nuclear and perhaps having other intermittent sources. So, I'm not diminishing the difficulty of the challenge. But the state has created a policy, and it's been upheld in the courts, and it is what it is. And unfortunately, it's not compatible, at least in terms of how PJM has framed it. I think their FRR alternative that the FERC suggested was interesting and creative and has some potential. I think if the state takes over capacity planning, then dealing with these other plants will certainly be something we have to confront.
Do you have any other questions? George? Oh, there's one
Here we
over
got
here.
one.
Oh, Joe, sorry, and
Hi.
then George. I guess Joe got the mic first.
So I have a question here. I'm talking just as a rate payer from Maryland. Around 2000, there was this concerns about the lack of generation and some out-of-the-market contracts there. And I'm so glad that finally the state of Maryland did not leave the state of PJM and did not FRR the load. Because at the end of the day, I think that what the rates that they pay are low, and the issue of resource adequacy and supply has been resolved. At the same time, I understand the concerns of the states, especially for the nuclear units, and I do believe that you can find solutions so that you provide the benefit of a competitive market to the rate payers as a part of the PJM instead of departing and rejecting the benefits of a competitive market.
I'm not sure I understood the question in that, but I think you're kind of talking about the tension that we have in Illinois with having been a leader in restructuring. Illinois was certainly among the states. I think Phil O'Connor, who many of you know, and recently passed, was the father of deregulation in Illinois, and the fact that we have half our generation from nuclear power. We have the largest fleet in the country. We have a 25% by 2025 RPS. So we'll have 75% by 2025. That will be, really potentially out of the capacity markets. And I don't know that I have a good answer for it. I mean, it's a really difficult question. But I think at the end of the day, Illinois and every other state in PJM, I think but 3, have expressed this interest in having support for renewables. or zero carbon-based generation. And so either we find a way to genuinely accommodate that rather than mitigate it, or we just have to find some alternative to deciding, how, determining capacity. A carbon price would be the best solution. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that's difficult to do in small areas and impossible to do, with one state at a time. But a carbon solution would be the most elegant solution, certainly. And we've been very supportive of markets in Illinois, and that would be a great way to address, I think, this issue that affects the nuclear power plants.
I think most economists, probably all economists, I see Arnie Quinn over there, and Emma Nicholson, would say that the most efficient approach would be to put a price on carbon and to set it at the appropriate level. And I should say Brien George and Rama Zakari and a whole host of Mason Emmett and a whole host of really smart people who I once worked with at FERC. Yeah, I think every economist would say that the most efficient approach would be to put a price on carbon and to set it at the right level. But NYU's Public Policy School actually did a very interesting study recently where they argued, and I think convincingly, that in the absence of a price on carbon, the second best approach would be to reward resources that don't produce the negative externality. Because otherwise, unless you have that kind of recognition for the benefit associated with those resources, the market will overproduce the electricity from resources that do produce the negative externality. And so, maybe it's not as efficient an approach as putting a price on carbon, but maybe it's the second best approach.
But you'd have to do it nationally, right?
Ideally.
Otherwise, it's like having lunch, and you go get your lunch, and you sit down, and, PJM's idea of accommodating you having lunch is to take your plate away and leave you the dinner roll and say, that's lunch. You're still getting lunch. It's not accommodating. It's mitigating. It's diminishing. It's taking away. And that's really the problem that we confront in Illinois.
Joe, you want to take the last question?
Yeah, so Chairman Sheahan, sorry, I did not mean to be saying you should leave PJM, just so we're clear. And I am in favor of carbon pricing, so we're clear about that. And in fact, what I was trying to say was that renewables and nuclear power plants, and particularly the nuclear power plants in your state, would all be competitive under standard competitive offers in the PJM capacity market. Therefore, there would not be any of the draconian mitigation of the type you're talking about. So if Illinois or any other state chose to return to cost of service, of course, there's the FRR option, but I was not suggesting that was the best option for you. In fact, I was trying to suggest that under our approach, it's actually friendly to the state's attempts to do more renewable energy. So I just wanted to be clear about that. Not exactly a question, but I appreciate your comments and just want to make that clear. Thank you.
I think we need to look at this also a little more broadly. So we're talking about all the generation that exists now and past generation. Are we looking ahead and looking to these small modular reactors, which may take the place of some of these compromised sites, that may take the place of some of the coal producing plants? Fuel cells, there's some that are like 59 megawatts now. Are we looking at that? Are we considering more in the future? We just aren't talking about that. We're talking about the past. And I think Stu hit on that we're not really looking at the future. And I think these are zero emission items that can take the place of some of these fossil plants. And we should be incentivizing, looking forward to moving to those. No one's going to be building a Vogtle plant, another Vogtle plant, or a SCANA. You're not going to have that situation. You're going to have to look to the future of nuclear in these small modular and building what needs to be built on site. And fuel cells being able to not only produce at a constant level, but also to capture that thermal load off of it and serve a larger area. So that there's a lot of things that could be done zero emission, but it's got to be given some weight and some consideration.
So let me just say that if you haven't read Joe's FERC filing, you should, because it's the only FERC filing I'm aware of that riffs off of A Tale of Two Cities. It actually has a line in there that says, it was the worst, it was the best of mopers, it was the worst of mopers.
There you go.
Right, so well worth the read, and he lays out in detail his current proposal.
All right, well, I'd like to thank the panel for their candor, insight, and perspectives. Can we get a round of applause for them? Okay, so if we'll let you off the hot seat, and then if Doug can come up and provide the closing remarks. Thank you all.
Well, that was a fantastic day. I want to thank all of the panelists and all of you for being here, and those who have been watching on the online. We tried to give you a variety of different perspectives, and I think we did that. I think we accomplished our goal to lay out these issues from a lot of perspectives. But as large a disagreements as folks had, speaking on behalf of the Great Plains Institute, we still think they invoked Minnesota nice in how they did that. So we're pleased with that. I think it's clear, as Tim said this morning, that while there isn't a lot going on in this domain, from Congress and some things that we've talked about from the administration, there is a whole lot of work and a whole lot of thought going into these really complex issues being done state and regional levels, and certainly at FERC. And in addition to all the issues that we discussed today, there's a huge amount of work going on in utility business model, which relates to everything we talked about today, is how to integrate more technology, more customer choice, and making sure that can be done in an economic way that also respects the needs of utilities from a business standpoint. And I think you heard that from the commissioners today. I think there's a lot of work that is going on carbon capture, which was discussed this morning, and other technologies such as storage, and how transmission plays into renewable energy growth, and a lot of different people working on all or some of these issues. And also issues in the seams between different RTO or ISOs and other balancing authorities. So there's a whole lot going on, even though sometimes, as Tim said this morning when he kicked us off, it doesn't always appear that way if you just read the scroll at the bottom of CNN or MSNBC or Fox. So I want to thank the Nicholas Institute folks. They are great to work with. We really appreciate that, and to all my colleagues at Great Plains Institute. I do want to lift up Jess Jellings, who's here, and Jill Rook, who's somewhere, probably out front, who really did so much work to make sure everybody was able to get here today and to put this on. These things don't just stage themselves, as you know, and Jess and Jill did a tremendous job putting that together, so thank you very much. Hopefully, you've taken some things from today's presentations. We'll make the slides available to you, and we will also use the information as we work with the PJM state regulators group. We have a meeting tomorrow, and then we'll have more in the future where we'll take into account all of the things that we heard today. We look forward to seeing you again next year. We hope to be able to do a couple more of these workshops next year. So if you have comments or suggestions to us about ways to make these better for you or more valuable for you, or topics that you think we ought to discuss, please seek us out and let us know. There will be the recording of today's events that will be in our websites going forward. So probably not right away, but after a couple of weeks, you'll be able to look for that as well. So I want to also thank the state officials for being here and remind them that tomorrow's meeting is not here in the hotel, but it's at the Duke facilities at 1201 Pennsylvania Avenue. So we look forward to meeting with you tomorrow. And with that, thanks again. Thanks so much for being here, for your questions, for hanging in all day too. I think that's a huge percentage of people stuck around all day, which is always a good sign. So we really thank you for that. Have a wonderful evening and a joyous holiday season. Thanks a lot.